This is H.D. Ingles, and I want to present to you another episode of Fascinating Facts, broadcast, of course, on the RUNUTS network. This episode is about United States rebellions. This is very important. I have attempted to avoid all opinions and show only facts. For starters, let me tell you my reference material. The portion about Shays' rebellion is taken from my book, A Stroll Through American History. The portion about the Whiskey Rebellion was obtained from my Facebook RUNUTS post of the same name. The remainder is taken from a History.com article about National Guard and federal troop deployments. Now, here we go. The United States rebellions. Now, firstly, my reason for this video, you should really have a reason if you're going to shoot your mouth off, shouldn't you? The summer of 2025, we all know the mess that is going on in Los Angeles. The rioting is extremely serious. When the National Guard and Marines were sent to quell the situation, people started screaming, "Never been done," unconstitutional, and other such nonsense. On top of that, there are major crime problems in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The National Guard, along with federal policing, have been sent to stop the plague of crime. You hear the same cries against this, unconstitutional, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to give you some facts, and the facts I'm showing belie those arguments. Start off with rebellions under the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a tax protest by Western Massachusetts farmers in 1786 and 1787, and proved that the federal government, if I can speak English, could not put down an internal rebellion. With no money, the federal government could not act to protect the perpetual union. That was the death knell of the Articles of Confederation. To quote George Washington in 1786, I do not conceive that we can exist long as a nation without a power which will pervade the whole union. The Confederation Congress agreed, and the Constitutional Convention of 1787 ended the Articles of Confederation. So now let's go to rebellions under the Constitution. 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion. In January 1791, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton proposed an excise tax on spirits distilled within the United States. This was the first tax ever enacted on a domestic product. Over objections from anti-federalists such as Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed the legislation. It was a tilted tax. Large producers paid the tax annually at a rate of 6 cents per gallon, which decreased with increased production. But small producers were obliged to pay the maximum 9 cents per gallon tax, and pennies were important in those days. Farms in the more populated eastern areas could sell their grain crops with no major problems, but frontier farmers in the West could not easily ship their grains east. As a consequence, they distilled their grains into whiskey, which was much easier to ship and preserve, but they were small producers. In other words, they paid the 9 cents per gallon tax. First signs of rebellion. The residents of Western Pennsylvania believed the tax unfair to those living on the frontier, and they refused to pay the tax. Then, beginning in October 1791, tax collectors were robbed, tarred, and feathered. The violence increased, and eventually shots were fired and a man was killed. Then in August of 1794, about 7,000 men marched on Pittsburgh. There was some damage, but that was the end of the violence. Then, in October 1794, President George Washington led an army of 12,000 into western Pennsylvania.
150 rebels were arrested, and 2 were convicted of treason. Both were pardoned by President Washington.
Next, the war between the states. It began in 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter and the secession of the southern states. Under the Militia Acts of 1792, Congress authorized the president to put state militias under federal authority and deploy them to stop the rebellion. Next, about 100 years later,
President Dwight D. Eisenhower deployed 1,200 Army troops to Little Rock, Arkansas. These troops were put in charge of around 10,000 Arkansas National Guard troops and were tasked with enforcing the integration of the all-white Central High School following incidents of racial violence. This was one of the earliest tests of desegregation in the American public school system. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy activated the Mississippi National Guard to help integrate the University of Mississippi. Then, in 1963, Kennedy sent the Alabama National Guard to do the same at the University of Alabama.
In 1965, Martin Luther King's march from Selma to Montgomery sparked racial violence, which lasted for about 3 weeks, causing President Lyndon B. Johnson to deploy the Alabama National Guard along with some U.S. Army troops to Selma to quell the violence. Now, the Detroit Uprising of 1967. Rioting broke out in Detroit following a raid by the Detroit Police Department on an unlicensed after-hours bar in a mostly black neighborhood. Parts of the city were burned and looted, and there was considerable violence between rioters and law enforcement. President Johnson sent around 8,000 Michigan National Guardsmen and another 5,000 U.S. Army troops to help restore law and order on the streets of Detroit.
In 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King, violent riots broke out in over 100 cities across the United States. President Johnson activated 1,750 National Guardsmen in Washington, D.C., along with around 12,000 federal military personnel. In Delaware, Governor Charles Terry used the National Guard to patrol black neighborhoods in the city of Wilmington for 9 months after the riots ended. This was the longest military occupation of an American city in history. In 1992, following the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers who had been charged with beating an unarmed black man named Rodney King during a traffic stop, violent riots broke out in the city of Los Angeles. President George H.W. Bush, using the Insurrection Act, federalized around 6,000 California National Guardsmen and deployed several thousand U.S. Army troops, as well as federal law enforcement, to help restore order.
That's it, folks. I hope you understand that sending troops to Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. in 2025 was not only constitutional, but had strong precedent. That's it. Thank you for watching.